In today's video, I'll show you how white's most natural moves in the Italian game after pawn to e4 quickly backfire. With just a few precise counterattacks, black not only sacrifices boldly, but also takes over the game and delivers a crushing attack. Let's talk about the different moves that your opponent can choose from. They can develop their knight, they can go for a more aggressive knight attack, or they can simply castle. For example, let's say your opponent chooses the simpler option and castles. Surprisingly, this very standard and generally advisable move turns out to be quite a big mistake. You can immediately capture the pawn on e4, and when your opponent tries to counter by bringing the rook to e1, at first it may look like you are in trouble. The rook is about to push your knight away, maybe capture the pawn, and your king appears somewhat exposed. But in reality, you have a very strong move, advancing the pawn to d5, which completely shuts down white's entire plan. This pawn on d5 not only defends your knight, but also attacks white's bishop on c4. Therefore, white will probably move the bishop away. At this point, they are still thinking quite optimistically about the position, because your knight is pinned. That means the move knight captures pawn on a5 is a threat, plus they are aiming to play pawn to d3, kick your knight away, and start some kind of attack on the e-file. They are imagining all of that, but you shut it down with another precise move, bishop to c5. You are brutally counterattacking and completely ignoring everything that white wants to do. From here, bishop captures pawn on f2 is a huge threat, creating a double attack against their king and rook. White will need to respond to that. Most likely, they will play pawn to d4, and after the exchange and knight recaptures, it may still feel like white is trying to build some attack against you. Now your knight is pinned and attacked, and the other knight is pinned as well. It looks like you might be in trouble, but you stay calm and simply castle your king to safety, away from danger. Not only does this solve the problem of the pin, but it also frees your knight completely. Therefore, you are now threatening to capture their knight on d4, so they must do something about that. On top of this, you are already up a pawn and have a more active position. If they try to trade knights, you have a very powerful in-between move. Can you spot it? Instead of capturing the knight immediately, you can insert this in-between check. Bishop captures pawn on f2, delivering a double attack. After the king moves, you can frankly win the game in different ways. One option is to play queen to h4, overwhelming white with threats to their rook, to their knight, and much more. And if they try to move the rook away, you even have a sneaky checkmate. Now, back to this critical position. If instead of capturing your knight with their knight, they capture with the bishop, then all of a sudden you drop this tactical bomb. You lure the king out and continue the attack. This is a double attack. In fact, after the king moves back, you just keep attacking. You deliver another check, and after the king moves once again, you completely overload your opponent with this bishop attack. At this moment, you are attacking the queen, still attacking the bishop, and you are also up 2 pawns. And if they decide to capture your bishop, then after queen captures rook on a 1, they are completely destroyed. The second most common mistake arises when white tries to go for the fried liver attack. In this position, you have a very surprising counterstrike. Knight captures pawn on e4. I really enjoy playing this Gambit in blitz games because the reputation is extremely complicated and unknown to 99% of opponents. First of all, knight captures pawn on a4 does not actually work for white, because after pawn to d5, you immediately regain your piece and end up with a good position. But certainly, the main question is, what if white carries out their main threat that began with the move knight to g5, and then captures the pawn on f7 with a fork against your queen and rook? At first glance, it looks like white is winning. However, in reality, this is already a decisive mistake by white, something extremely difficult to understand if they are unfamiliar with the following lines. You respond with queen to h4, and this begins a very powerful counterattack. White already has no sufficient defense against it. For example, if they simply castle, thinking that it is the easiest way to protect the pawn on f2, you immediately unleash the tactical bomb. Knight captures pawn on f2, sacrificing the knight and attacking the queen. After white captures the knight, bishop to c5 follows, pinning the rook, which is now attacked twice. White is forced to respond to that. On top of this, you are also threatening their bishop. If they play queen to f3, which is the most commonly chosen move, then after rook to f8, the pressure of your pins becomes absolutely unbearable. You simply have far too many threats for white to deal with, especially with the possibility of knight to d4 coming in as well. In many cases, white tries pawn to g3, at least attempting to chase your queen away. But now it is time for you to start collecting material. You capture the rook with check, then you capture the bishop, and meanwhile, their knight remains pinned. Therefore, on the next move, you literally capture every single piece of white's one by one, and you finish with an extra rook. If you have been following for some time, then you already know that the most brutal way to counter the Italian game is the Russo Gambit, where you challenge white's center immediately. The interesting part here is that white's most popular and most natural move, to accept the sacrifice pawn, is actually already a mistake. This allows you to push your central pawn forward and drive away their knight. Of course, the opening itself is still quite complex. The key idea is that white's knight has no good squares. If they try to pin and counterattack, you mirror the move, defending your pawn. White is then forced to retreat the knight, and once you develop to f6, they're already in trouble. They cannot develop this knight, and therefore they cannot castle. If instead they try to play pawn to d3, offering a trade of pawns they might hope that you will capture, then they can trade queens and reach an endgame with an extra pawn. But of course, we have something completely different prepared for them. You play knight to d4, which attacks the queen as well as the pawn on c2. Now the queen must retreat either to d1 or to d2 in order to guard the pawn on c2. Then imagine that your opponent looks away for a moment, perhaps to pat their dog, and when they look back, you play knight captures pawn on c2. This is an extremely strong double attack against the king and the rook. You sacrifice the knight because immediately after that you have yet another double attack ready, and with it you completely win the game. You might be thinking, okay, that was just a sudden tactical trick by black, but not really. Because what else can your opponent possibly play if not pawn to d3? They still cannot develop their knight. How about developing the other knight? Well, then you just keep attacking. You play knight to d4, still targeting the queen and the pawn, which forces the queen all the way back to d1. And you never stop attacking. Now you push pawn to d5. This time, you are willing to sacrifice a pawn just to accelerate your development. After the trade and bishop captures pawn on f5, all of a sudden you have a winning attack. There are simply too many threats. One is to push your pawn forward to clear the diagonal for the bishop, followed by knight captures pawn on c2. Another threat is queen to c5, which creates a double attack against the bishop and the pawn. Finally, you can simply castle, which also pressures the bishop, and with that you hold a massive advantage in development. If white ever tries something like pawn to c3, hoping to chase your knight back, they will face another unpleasant surprise. Instead of retreating, your knight jumps forward with check. If it is captured, that opens a devastating discovered attack along the e-file. The king must move somewhere, but what can white do? King to f1 is not an option because of the bishop check, which would lead to checkmate within just a couple of moves. If instead white tries knight to e2, I'll give you a couple of seconds to try to spot the winning move on your own. It is a really beautiful shot. You would love to play queen captures knight on e2 checkmate, but you cannot do that immediately since the knight is defended. So first, you deflect the queen by playing bishop to c2, and then you win the game. I hope you enjoyed this video and understand all these variations. If you found this video is helpful for you, then stay tuned by like and subscribing. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.